Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this month's webinar. Just a few quick announcements before we start. One, we still have funding available for farmers through the Community Engagement Grant, which is an opportunity to get financial support for hosting community events, and that's in an effort to improve social license. We also have funding available still for the Farmer to Farmer Exchange Program and the Business Economic Research Program. So you can find more info for these on our website, and I'm going to throw the link to our website and the funding opportunities in the chat. And here it is. Okay. So, and lastly, just to save the date for our biennial Research Development and Education Summit, it's going to be held January 9th at Maine Maritime Academy. And keep your eyes out for an upcoming survey that we'll be sending out that will help us help inform our research development and education report. So today we'd like to welcome Sebastian Belle from the Maine Aquaculture Association for his presentation on why aquaculture is important to the future of Maine's working waterfront. If you have any questions for our presenter, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll likely save most of the questions for the end, unless it's has to do with something we're talking about, and then I can pop in and ask the questions with Sebastian. All right, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Emily, and thank you to the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center for hosting the seminar series. I know you've had a great series of seminars, and people are definitely learning a lot from your series on aquaculture in Maine. So I'm Sebastian Belle with the Maine Aquaculture Association. We are the trade association in the state of Maine. We represent the growers in the state of Maine, both finfish, shellfish, and seaweed. We are the oldest state aquaculture association in the country. I'm here today to talk to you about how Maine aquaculture and Maine aquaculture businesses can play a role in the preservation of working waterfronts. I'm going to start with a little bit of history and then get down to what's really going on now. Oops, let's see if I can get why doesn't my page function go? Oh, my thing is not advancing. 2 seconds here. Okay, let's try that. Now let's try this. Okay, great. Apologies. So working waterfronts and the challenge that they face in the state of Maine have been a subject of discussion in the state for many, many years. And in fact, starting way back in 1989, there were a whole series of studies that have been conducted looking at working waterfronts along the coast of Maine. And we're lucky in Maine. We actually still have some working waterfronts compared to some of the other states on the east coast of Maine. And many of those studies have been quite comprehensive. They've gone up and down the coast. They've mapped where working waterfronts existed. And then they've kind of gone through an analytical process looking at what are the things that are putting working waterfronts at risk and how we can maybe help preserve them. And they've come to a series of kind of common conclusions. All of the studies have often come up to very similar conclusions, even though they've been conducted over a 20 or 30-year period. The first thing is that there's a relatively small number of working waterfront properties along the coast, and the area that they occupy is surprisingly small. If you look at the coast of Maine, it's over 3,000 miles, and the last kind of quantitative summary of how many miles of working waterfront properties we had said we had 20, and more recent studies have said we have significantly lower than that. The four things that have kind of been identified in those surveys and those kind of geographic surveys is that because of the tides we have in Maine here, not all working waterfront properties have all tide access. And in fact, a surprisingly small number within that small number have all tide access. And what that means is that people who are loading or unloading commercial product, whether it's commercial fishing or whether it's aquaculture, have to work the tides. They cannot get into that piece of property on all the tides that we have here in Maine. The second thing that popped out, and this has been more recently, is that parking is almost as important as the actual working waterfront property itself, because when somebody goes to work on the water, they have to park somewhere. And often parking is at a premium, or there may be no parking associated with the particular commercial working waterfront property. And that has become a big problem, as has gear storage. And this is particularly true for the lobstering industry, but it's also true for our sector as well. When you talk about storing gear close to the wharf that you're using, many times people have no choice but to just load the gear on a truck and truck it away to another piece of property. And finally, the thing which has started to come out in the more recent studies is we have places in the state where we effectively have geographic deserts. We have bays that maybe only have one, or maybe not even have one piece of working waterfront in a bay. And so people are having to start to steam longer distances from the working waterfront properties in order to access the area of the water that they work in, whether you're a lobsterman or whether you're an aquaculture person. So those geographic deserts are becoming more and more important. We're seeing areas of the coast where, even though there might be a significant area of the coast, significant area in the bay, there's no commercial access for working waterfront people within that bay, and they have to go around to another bay or another. They may have to trailer their boats, or they may have to steam much longer in order to access the place that they work. One of the other things that came out of all of the studies is the majority of working waterfront properties in the state are privately held. And the implications of that are they are probably at elevated risk of conversion to non-commercial working waterfronts. So if somebody has a family home with a wharf and it's privately held, and somebody offers them double the value of the property, they're probably more likely to convert that into a non-commercial working waterfront piece of property than, say, a piece of property which is publicly held by either the state or the municipality. One of the other conclusions of the studies is that the public facilities we do have in the state are coming under increasing use and increasing pressure. So because we're seeing constraints on the privately held pieces of property, the public facilities are becoming more and more used, and there are conflicts between commercial and non-commercial conflicts in those properties. And the classic case is a boat launch ramp, or maybe a public wharf that supports both the harbor with moorings for recreational yachts, for example, but is also the same wharf that the commercial folks are landing their product over. And finally, with respect to the public facilities, there is a tremendous backlog of maintenance that has not happened. So particularly public entities tend not to build into their budgets ongoing yearly maintenance for a public facility. And so they wait until that facility is kind of so broken down and either dangerous or non-functional that they then go out to raise money to increase the maintenance. So there are lots of public facilities in the state that have a lot of maintenance issues. And we really saw that last winter when the storms came through and destroyed both private and public properties and working waterfronts. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So we are losing commercial working waterfronts in the state of Maine, and we've known this for a while, but the thing that we have seen in the more recent studies is that the rate of loss has accelerated quite dramatically, and this is particularly true after COVID. And there are a number of things that are driving that. First and foremost, although we as citizens of the state of Maine feel that it's difficult to be able to purchase a piece of waterfront property, they seem expensive to us. For people who are moving from Washington, D.C., or Connecticut, or Rhode Island, or Massachusetts, or New York, we are still a relatively cheap date from a real estate price point of view. And so people can afford to sell their house in Washington, come to Maine, buy a piece of working waterfront property, convert it to residential as opposed to working waterfront, and still have, $500,000 in cash left over. So we're still a cheap date in the big picture on the East Coast, even though for us as Maine citizens, it seems expensive. That has driven, along with the fact that we've developed and invested as a state very aggressively in fiber optic networks in remote areas, all along the coast in particular, that's driven the ability of people to come to Maine and work remotely. And so prior to COVID, we were actually losing population in the state of Maine. Post-COVID, we have been gaining population. And in fact, the population growth in Maine is one of the fastest of any state in the country. And virtually all of that population growth has been in coastal communities. So that has driven a demographic shift in those coastal communities that impacts how working waterfronts interact with communities and impacts whether or not working waterfronts can survive in the face of this shift in demographics and the real estate market. The last two things are, and the last winter storms really brought this to a head. Climate change is dramatically putting pressure on working waterfronts in particular because we are dependent on access to water. And so our wharfs, our piers, our processing plants, packing plants, which are next to the water, are all susceptible to all the effects of climate change, whether it is rise in sea level, whether it's increasing frequency and severity of storms. And so last year, if you add up all the various storms we had, depending on whose numbers you believe, we probably lost somewhere between 50 and 60% of the key infrastructure along the coast of Maine that is linked to working waterfronts. So we lost piers, we lost gas shacks, bait shacks, we had processing or packing plants that were impacted by this. And many of those properties had been there for quite a while and probably didn't have the capital to invest in rebuilding those properties. And so now one of the things that everybody in the state is quite concerned about is if a working waterfront property lost its pier and the owners of that property, most of whom are private citizens, don't have the capital reserves to rebuild that piece of property, what are they going to do? And the state has stepped up and the federal government has stepped up and tried to help by giving money to help people rebuild. But the reality is, if you look at the amount of money that's come from the state and federal government versus what the actual capital needs are for that working waterfront infrastructure, we're not even close to matching the capital needs for the reinvestment in that working waterfront structure to rebuild. And so we have lots of properties along the coast that have lost their ability to serve the working waterfront and likely are owned by private citizens whose only option is to sell the property as opposed to continue to use it or as opposed to reinvesting in it as a working waterfront property. And that's a big problem. And we haven't seen the full impacts of that yet. I think it will play out over a number of years. But I would argue that that's really going to reduce dramatically the number of working waterfront properties we have along the coast of Maine. All of this is very consistent with a study that was done by the State Planning Office in the year 2000, and they analyzed how demographic patterns were going to shift over time, and they essentially predicted what was going to happen. So they did the study in 2000. The little blocks in red are what are classified as suburban or urban areas, and that's due to how many people live in a municipality or a county. And they predicted that in 2050, Maine would look like this on the right-hand side. And the folks at the state government are in the process of kind of reassessing where we are, but what they are saying before they publish anything is we are already surpassing the 2050 predictions. And for anybody who lives along the coastline, you can probably see that that's the case. So we've had these demographic shifts. COVID has accelerated them. Those have increased property values and taxes along the coast. And for people who have grown up in those communities, particularly traditional working waterfront families who are linked to the ocean to make a living, but perhaps don't have the financial resources that people who are moving into those communities have, it's very difficult to continue to live in those communities, and particularly for the next generation, for the younger people. And so we are seeing it, and I'm sure our colleagues in the commercial fishing sector are seeing it, that young people are having a very hard time finding an affordable place to live in coastal communities. And so they're actually working waterfront families and young people in working waterfront families and people who work in working waterfront businesses are actually moving away from coastal communities. So they're accelerating this demographic shift that we're talking about in terms of people who are linked to the ocean to make a living versus people who have no connection to the ocean as a way to make a living. So in Maine, we have a choice. We still have a working waterfront, but we have a choice between viable working waterfront harbors and communities and either derelict docks that have been washed away and are waiting to be converted to residential development, or McMansions. And if you look at the average size of a piece of residential property that touches the ocean in the state of Maine, it has consistently gotten smaller and smaller. So we're essentially chopping up the coast of Maine into little mini estates and developing them for residential purposes. That is the reality that we face as a state. We are lucky that we still have working waterfronts, but those working waterfronts are based on the ability to make a living on the ocean. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today. So what can we do? What have we done as a state? Maine is unusual. They've taken some initiatives from a public policy point of view, from a public investment point of view that other states haven't. And Maine is in many ways being viewed as a model by other states around the country in terms of what are the kinds of tools you can use to preserve your working waterfront and to give working waterfronts the ability to continue to thrive in the face of these other pressures that are happening around them. In terms of Maine, we've done a series of things from a public policy point of view. There are some communities that have taken either as a result of zoning, and Portland would be a great example of that. Portland was really a leader in this, and in the 90s, they actually zoned their waterfront to help preserve working waterfronts. It was very controversial. There were certainly big developers, real estate developers, that were against the zoning approach, but they carved out areas along the waterfront that would be available only for waterfront, working waterfront development. And if there was other development, they had to include working waterfront development in those developments. In addition to that, many communities along the coast of Maine right now are going through a revision of their comprehensive plan. Every community along the coast has one. Some of them are very highly developed and some of them are not developed at all. But one of the things that those of us who represent working waterfront businesses are doing is trying to convince communities to build into their comprehensive plans protections for working waterfronts within their comprehensive plan. The other thing from a public policy point of view that the state has done is they have made some direct investments in working waterfronts. So they've actually invested either in public facilities or private facilities through the Working Waterfront Preservation Fund, where you can put a conservation or working waterfront easement on your property, and the state will give you, if you get through the process, and it's kind of a complicated process to get through, but they will actually pay you for that easement so you can get a direct investment into that property, and you can use that investment to reinvest in the property. And then there are also some tax incentives that are out there. So the current use taxation plan would be an example where if you put a working waterfront covenant on your property, theoretically at least, you should be assessed at a lower tax rate than if it was a residential property. And there are still some bugs to work out with those systems. There are some other things that have happened in Maine, public and private partnerships. Some of the land trusts have moved into the space and included in some of the properties that they have either purchased or put easements on working waterfront covenants. But what I want to talk about today is a different tool that's often not really thought about, which is one of the most effective ways to help working waterfronts survive is to ensure that there are viable businesses that are linked to working waterfronts that don't need subsidies, don't need public money, that are viable enough that they, in fact, are a business that makes the numbers work, if you will. And part of that is hanging on to a piece of working waterfront as part of their business model. So there are some big picture things going on. I'm not going to go spend a lot of time with this, but the reality is there are some big trends in the world that are going to impact what happens in Maine. And the bottom line is we are having increasing challenges producing food on land. And those challenges are not going to get easier. They're going to get worse, in particular, the challenge around water and some of the nutrient challenges for terrestrial agriculture, as well as the fact that we are losing agricultural land at a global basis at around 100,000 hectares a year. That means that we have less and less area, and it's harder and harder to produce food on land. And we are seeing that in the big crops globally. So yields for rice, corn, wheat have essentially plateaued in the last 10 years, while population is increasing and the standard of living is increasing. And so what that means is we're being kind of caught between a rock and a hard place from a resource point of view. And if you talk to anybody who's in the food system world, they are extremely concerned about how we are going to feed the world as we move forward. To put things in perspective, in my children's generation, we will have to double the amount of food that we grow on the face of the globe in order to just maintain the status quo. And for those of you who aren't in the food world, the status quo ain't great. We've got 7.6 billion, and roughly 1 billion of those people on the face of the earth are in a food security challenge position. So we're not doing great to begin with. We've got a population increase coming. We've got standards of living increase coming, and we've got resources from a terrestrial agriculture point of view that are increasingly challenging. And so that's why aquaculture in particular, the increase in aquaculture, the interest in aquaculture is increasing, and that's impacting us here in Maine. In part, that's impacting us here in Maine because in the United States of America, which is the third largest seafood market in the world, if you compare seafood as a protein to other proteins in the marketplace, we produce very little of the protein, the seafood protein that we consume in this country. We produce a relatively small percent of that domestically. If you compare that to all the other protein, animal protein in particular groups, we essentially produce most of those animal proteins in the United States of America. In the case of seafood and aquaculture seafood, even more so, we produce relatively little of that in the United States of America. And so for us as domestic seafood producers, that's an opportunity. It's very important to remember that aquaculture is a little different than commercial fishing. In commercial fishing, we are limited in terms of what we are going to produce by the resource itself. And so the whole area of fisheries management and how you manage a fishery sustainable is really important, because if you exceed the harvesting levels that you should for a carrying capacity in that ecosystem, if you take too much out of it, then the resource contracts and you are resource limited from a fishing point of view. In the case of aquaculture, we are not resource limited. We are permission limited. In other words, we create our own resource. If we create a farm in an area, we then grow the resource on that farm, and we do it coming out of hatcheries to create the resource. And so we're not resource limited, we are permission limited. And that's a really important distinction between commercial fisheries and aquaculture. So for me, as an advocate for domestic farmers, I look at this graph and I see the space between what we currently produce and what we consume, this big blank spot in the blue. And I view that as an opportunity. We could grow our domestic production and satisfy our domestic markets. And there's lots of opportunity to do that. One of the things that's driving the demand for Maine aquaculture and seafood in particular is we are within a 24-hour drive of 130 million consumers. That's Chicago East and Atlanta North. So we have a tremendous market locally that we can satisfy with fresh seafood from Maine. So Maine aquaculture in particular has grown. It's grown slowly but steadily over the last 20 years, and there are a whole series of things that have driven that growth, but I want to highlight a couple of them. First and foremost is we have amazing growing conditions here in Maine. We have clean water, we have space, and and we have cold water, although it's warming. And obviously, as farmers and as commercial fishermen, we're concerned about that and we're tracking it. But the water quality in Maine is some of the best in America. If you look at the EPA reports, every year EPA issues what's called a 305 report, and it classifies waters around the country based on a state-by-state basis. And Maine consistently is in the top 5 and many times in the top 3 of any state in the country with respect to our water quality. That matters to us because the quality of the water in which we grow our products directly translates into the quality of our product. And so the better the quality of the water we're growing in, the better the quality of our product. We have a one-stop permitting system in Maine, which was developed many years ago. It's kind of eroded over the years, and I'll be glad to answer questions about that. But right now, I think it's in jeopardy. It's not as simple as it used to be. We do have a leasing system, so we as farmers have to lease from you, the citizens of the state of Maine, an area. And that leasing system is designed to be scaled to the risk of the operation. So the higher, in particular, the environmental risk or the risk of user conflict, then the more rigorous the leasing system. And that kind of makes sense from a practical point of view. We have a system which has lowered the barrier to entry for small farms. That's our limited purpose aquaculture licensing system. And that was designed to let small owner-operator farmers start up, experiment with aquaculture, and try areas to see if they were a good area or not. We also have a very rigorous environmental monitoring program that's been around for a lot of years. And that's one of the things that, from a grower perspective, has been most helpful to us as growers. It's allowed us to learn about the specific characteristics of each site and what the carrying capacity is of that site and how we can farm in synergy with nature as opposed to exceeding that carrying capacity. And in the early days of those environmental monitoring programs, we learned some hard lessons. We definitely learned that some of the farming practices that we were using were not sustainable. They were in excess of the carrying capacity of the site. And so we took that environmental monitoring data and fed it back into our farming practices, and it really changed the way we farmed in Maine. We still have working waterfront traditions in Maine, as unlike some of the other states we have. And probably one of the things which has grown aquaculture in the state of Maine is the series of training academies that have been conducted over the years. A lot of different entities in the state have been involved in those training academies. They put quite a few people through those training academies, and many of those people have gone on to start their own small farms and begin to scale up over time. So the growth rate in Maine over the last 20 years has averaged about 2% per year. Globally, aquaculture is the fastest growing food production method in the world and has been growing at about 8% per year over the last 20 years. In the United States of America, the growth rate in aquaculture has been roughly 1%, or actually a little bit below 1%. We've had some contraction in the catfish industry because of competition from producers in other countries with similar fish. The agricultural growth rate, so globally the agricultural growth rate, the growth in agriculture over the same period of time, the last 20 years, has been roughly 1.1% per year. So that gives you a sense of scale of how aquaculture is growing as a food production method versus agriculture as a whole. More recently, growth rates in agriculture have begun to tail off, and we are looking at some real challenges I alluded to earlier in how we produce food on land. So what can we do, and how does this all relate to working waterfronts? Well, we talked about the public policy initiatives in Maine, and Maine has really distinguished itself in that regard. We've talked about the public-private partnerships. I think you're going to see more of those. I think you're going to see more partnerships with land trusts. Probably something that a lot of people don't know about the coast of Maine is that roughly 30% of the riparian land in the coast of Maine, so 30% of the land that touches the water, has some form of either conservation easement or is owned by either the federal government or the state government or a private land trust. So we have a tremendous amount of area along the coast of Maine which is in conservation already. Very little of that, frankly, right now is linked to working waterfront easements. And so we are hopeful, at least as a farmers advocacy group, that there could be increases in those partnerships, and we'll see more strategic partnerships between the private land trust community and the commercial working waterfront community, where we can begin to work together and use some of those properties that are currently in conservation trusts, and begin to find ways for them to also be used as working waterfront conservation trusts as we go forward. But what I want to just kind of end with here is there's another tool that isn't often talked about, but is really one of the most powerful tools we have in terms of conserving working waterfronts, which is to make sure that the businesses who use those working waterfronts are viable and are competitive. And that's really what we in the aquaculture sector are all about, trying to figure out ways to make those businesses more viable, more competitive, so that they don't need a whole series of subsidies or other public policy programs, that they can be resilient and viable on their own because their business model is sustainable and because they're making money and able to reinvest in those properties. When you talk about developing a business or developing an economic sector, there's lots of different pieces to it, and I'm only going to talk about a few of them. But if you look in the upper left-hand side of this slide, there's really three things that come together. You have to have demand, you have to have the resources to satisfy that demand, and you have to have a climate that allows investors, people who have money or are willing to risk their capital, to invest and take a chance to try and develop a business to satisfy that market demand. Within the business climate piece, there are a whole series of other things that play into that, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but I just talk quickly about available resources. Maine is actually, in the aquaculture sector, a pretty interesting space. We have invested in a whole series of pieces which aren't directly subsidizing businesses, but are satisfying the needs of the businesses. So, for example, we have a very energetic and viable research community in Maine that's focused on aquaculture. We probably have the best cold water marine aquaculture research facilities in North America in the state of Maine. We also have some of the best intellectual capital in the state of Maine. We've attracted people from both around the country and around the world who are experts in aquaculture research. We have some of the best educational training, and that focuses on workforce development as well as entrepreneurial support. So we have educational programs which are designed to both train workers for farms, as well as educational programs that are designed to train entrepreneurs who want to develop aquaculture businesses. And then we've taken advantage of technology transfer quite aggressively for Maine. So we've sent people all over the world to learn from other people, other businesses in other parts of the world, to bring that expertise back to Maine, and not reinvent the wheel, but to use the lessons that are learned in other parts of the world to support the development of viable businesses here in Maine. So those pieces are quite unique. They've been brought together in a quite conscious manner by a group of people who are the leaders in the state of Maine, and people are noticing what's happening in Maine. We're attracting young people to Maine to come to Maine because they view it as a place where aquaculture is a dynamic sector. There's opportunity from a career point of view, there's opportunity from a business point of view, and that's exactly what we want to happen. We want people to come to Maine to view it as a place of opportunity, as well as young people in those coastal communities looking at aquaculture as a way to continue their family maritime heritages. So if you're in a working waterfront family and you can't get a fishing license, maybe aquaculture is the way to continue that family tradition, yes, just using a different tool. One of the things I think which is often forgotten in all of this is that many times people focus on regulations, and they think that it's all about the regulatory climate, either as a way to stimulate development or as a way to hold it back. And I just would like to remind everybody that although regulations are important, and on the left-hand side of this, you'll see that regulations impact social license, your ability to get a lease site, how long that lease site is available to you, so security of tenure, and also what restraints are placed on you to ensure that you don't have negative environmental impacts or negative social impacts. But that's really only 25% of the development equation. Once you satisfy all of that stuff on the left-hand side, you then have, as a business person, to satisfy all the things on the right-hand side of this equation, which actually are after you get all your permissions and your development permits and your social license, what have you. So regulations are important. We from the industry support regulations that are rational, that achieve good results, that are measurable, that are not regulations that are just for regulation's sake, but they really seek to achieve a result that everybody agrees on. But once you get past those regulations, an individual business person, an individual owner operator, or whether they're not an owner operator, they have to satisfy all the other things on the right side of this equation before they are beginning to become a successful business. So if you think about somebody coming into the aquaculture sector as an investor, they're either going to try to find somebody who's willing to take a risk on them, or they're going to put their house on a line. They might put an existing business on a line. They might have family and friends who are willing to take a chance on them. But they need to develop a certain level of confidence before they're willing to invest in that business. And investor confidence really boils down to three things. One is what you're proposing to do and the circumstances around it and the results from that exercise, are they predictable? Can you make some educated guesses about what's going to happen if you do what you say you're going to do, you convince people to help you do what you say you're going to do? Is what's going to come out of that a predictable outcome? The second thing, obviously, is there an opportunity? Can you actually get an opportunity to build that business? So is the market there? Can you get a lease? Is there an opportunity in a particular community that you want to develop your farm in? So opportunity has to be there clearly. And then finally, and one that I think a lot of people who probably aren't from the business community don't understand, is that you have to be able to both predict what the risks are and have tools to control those risks. So you may have a business plan, you may have an idea about a product you want to grow, you may know what the market is, but there may be some risks associated with it, whether that's the risk of not getting a license, or whether that's the risk of that market going away, or maybe it's the risk of interest rates going up, or maybe it's the risk of a product being grown in another country at a lower cost coming into the marketplace. There are lots of different risks that are out there that you have to assess before you even decide to go into business, and before you even decide to begin to take the time and effort and energy to take that chance. So predictability, the ability to know and understand what the opportunity is, and then the ability to understand what the risks are and develop tools to manage those risks, are really, those three things boil into investor confidence. And it's surprisingly, it's hard to quantify all of those things. And when you talk to people who are willing to start businesses, some of them are calculated guesses. There's no formula out there. There's no manual out there. And so they have to, at some point, take a chance, take a wing and a prayer, and go forward with what is a calculated risk. And it has to do with their level of confidence. How confident are they that the risks and the capital that they're seeking to raise are going to actually produce something which is positive, not negative. If you look at the sector as a sector whole, and you think about it from a state perspective, then all of these things are the kinds of things that an investor, whether they're from a community or whether they're coming in from the outside of the community, they will look at to see whether or not this sector is worth investing in. And there's within each of these bullets, there's lots of sub-bullets about what the questions an investor will ask of the state. One of the challenges we have in the state is there's a lot of emphasis on the regulations around controlling environmental risk, controlling user conflict, making sure that the natural environment is protected, making sure that riparian owners' rights are respected, other user groups are respected. There's relatively little investment and state infrastructure or expertise on the other side of the equation, which is what are the things you need as a business person to support and develop your business. And so Maine is really focused for many, many years on all of the things that restrain development, and they haven't really developed the other side of the equation as much about how do you help businesses and investors take risk and feel comfortable about building businesses in Maine. And that's different than some of the other sectors we have in Maine, where we've actually invested quite substantially in those sectors. The forestry industry would be a great example, where the state over the years has invested very significantly in supporting the forestry industry and giving investors, whether they are owner operators or whether they are businesses, the confidence to make those investments. So this is our vision as an association of where we would be in 2030 for the Maine aquaculture sector. First and foremost, people who are going into the sector would be assured that there was some security of tenure, that if they got a license, that was a license that had some stability to it. It wasn't going to be taken away from them for political reasons. It wasn't going to be taken away from them because a very wealthy person went to the governor and said, you need to pull the license on this operation because we don't like to look at it. There has to be clarity and regulatory stability. And by that, I mean an operator who's applying for the permission to go into this sector needs to know specifically what's expected of them, what they will be required to do, and that isn't going to change from year to year. And just as an example, since aquaculture started in the state of Maine, every year in the legislature, we have had significant changes proposed where even existing companies that are operating on the existing agreed upon regulations would be impacted by a change in those regulations. And so from a business point of view, it's very difficult to plan your business if you feel like the goalposts are constantly moving. The permitting process has to be timely, efficient, and effective, and that's been an ongoing challenge in Maine. We're still there. We still have a backlog in lease applications. And we as an association have gone to bat repeatedly for the Department of Marine Resources to get them more resources so that they have more staff to deal with the aquaculture sector. And it is still a challenge. We're still having long waits for leases, and understand clearly that somebody can apply for a lease. They may have to wait 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, or in some cases as long as 6 years before they get a decision on that lease. And that decision may be no at the end of it. It may not be yes. So as an applicant, you don't know whether you're going to get a yes or a no until the very end of that process. And that can be quite intimidating, particularly for people coming from traditional working waterfront families who are not used to ask permission to go down to the ocean to make a living. We would like to see non-duplicative regulations, and there are in some cases duplications between federal regulations and state regulations, and sometimes those regulations conflict, and that's very frustrating, certainly for a farmer, when you're being asked to do one thing by one agency and do something different by another agency. And we're lucky in Maine that hasn't happened too often. Recently, it did happen in the early years of our sector, but I think there is a risk of that happening more and more as the federal government becomes more and more involved in the aquaculture space. We certainly would like to see more startups in the state, and we'd like to see an economic development plan for the state that balances this need to regulate the sector as well as the need to support the development of the sector. So we'd like to see a rebalancing of that between the regulatory side of the house and the development side of the house. We are very lucky in Maine. We have one of the most diverse aquaculture sectors in the country in terms of species and production methods. And that was hugely important to us when COVID hit. Over 80% of seafood in the United States of America is consumed in restaurants. Our markets overnight went to almost zero. And the only people who had markets were our larger growers who had great connections with the retail outlets. Those retail outlets, the big buyers like the Hannafords, the Wegmans, they have very strict buying systems and standards. And so it's very difficult for a smaller grower to comply with those. And so most of our smaller growers weren't able to sell to the larger retail outlets. Consumption of seafood when COVID hit flipped from the restaurants to retail. And so retail consumption of seafood increased dramatically. And so our big buyers went to, and our big growers went to the small growers and said, give us your product and we will get it through us into that retail system. And so that really, that diversity of company size was critical in saving many of our smaller growers. And we would not have predicted that. We didn't understand that dynamic was there. Those relationships have continued. And so for us as a state, I think this diversity of both species, production methods, and company size is really important to the resiliency of our sector and its ability to help working waterfronts survive in the future as we go forward. And finally, Maine has some of the largest freshwater resources of any state east of the Mississippi. We have a very little aquaculture development in our freshwater resources. And so there are some opportunities there to develop the sector on the freshwater side. So I will stop there. We believe that aquaculture has a role to play in helping working waterfronts survive as we go forward here. One of the interesting phenomena that we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of young people come into the aquaculture sector and a lot of young people from traditional working waterfront families. The membership of our association 30 years ago was almost entirely comprised of people from a marine biology background. And the membership right now in our association is mostly people probably coming from working waterfront families who are using aquaculture as a way to diversify their economic base. They may be the sons and daughters of fishermen who haven't been able to get a commercial fishing permit, or they may be commercial fishermen who are using aquaculture as a means to bed hedge around the changes that are happening in some of the resource bases as climate change impacts the coast of Maine. As all of you know, the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming water bodies in the world, and that's resulting in shifts in the distribution of some of our major species that we fish for commercially. So lobster will be the great example where we're seeing lobster populations moving north and moving into deeper waters than they have historically been. And so the future of working waterfronts that are linked to lobster is evolving, and aquaculture is just another tool that people can use to continue those maritime heritages in the communities they grew up in, but do it in a slightly different way. So I will end there, and thank you very much for all of your attention.
Thanks so much, Sebastian. I'm going to bring everybody back in the frame here.
Do you want me to stop sharing my screen, Emily? Is that?
That's up to you. You can leave it if you want.
Okay.
I have just a couple of questions before we wrap.
Yep.
This first question is very specific. It's from me. I've seen that 2% growth statistic a couple of times before, and I've wondered if you have more info on, is it related to like the value of the industry or the size or the number of leases? Yeah, if you could.
So, yeah, no, great question, Emily. And you're not the first person to ask that question. It's the acreage. So if you look at value, it's actually grown faster than the acreage. And we've had a couple of growth spurts in Maine. So if you chose to a time period that was slightly different, the growth rate might be a little bit higher, it might be a little bit lower. We've basically had 3 growth periods in the sector. The first was the late 70s, early 80s, where we went from 0 to 600 acres, and then there was another growth period where we went from 600 to about 1,200 acres, and then there was a third growth period where we went from 1,200 to around 1,700 acres. So depending on where you pick those 20 years, that's the growth rate. But that, I can't remember exactly the years that 20 years encompasses, but it's kind of the middle of the road.
Excellent, thank you. Next question's from one of our attendees. How does the rise and evolution of the co-op model play into working waterfront access for aquaculture?
It's a great question, and yeah, as I'm sure your questioner knows, Maine has a long tradition of co-ops in the lobster community in particular. We've certainly seen an increase in folks who are interested in co-ops in aquaculture in the state, and I think that's just an awesome trend. You know, for people who are moving into the co-op space, if they come to us from an association perspective and ask for help, we always help them irrespective of whether they are members or not. Some people have asked for help, other people haven't. But I think co-ops will play a really important role as we go forward here, in particular, because they give smaller growers an ability to pool their resources, whether it's buying resources around equipment or whether it's marketing resources around their collective production, or whether it's distribution. One of the challenges we have here in Maine is we do have a lot of small growers that are spread out over a very wide geographic area. And for a trucking company to go pick up the product that they grow of, say, let's say 2,000 oysters at the end of a peninsula in down East Maine, it's very difficult to make the economics work. But if you get a group of growers together who form a co-op, then you get more volume, and you might be able to either justify a trucking company coming in, or you might be able to justify that group of growers buying a truck to do their own delivery. We lobbied very hard for a change to the regulations in Maine, and this was probably 5 or 6 years ago, to allow for what are called bus stop pickups. Historically, in the shellfish industry, you couldn't go from farm to farm to pick up product because of the regulations. And so we went to the state and worked with them and got a change to the law that allows for a trucking company to go and pick up multiple at multiple stops, if you will, from multiple growers. But the co-op model, I think, has a lot of potential in Maine, and we certainly from the association are very supportive of it, and anything that we can do to help that, glad to help in any way we can.
Great, thanks. One more audience question. What type of shoreside facilities do aquaculture farmers need?
Great question. They run the gamut. So it could be literally just a wharf and a float and some moorings. Typically, once a farmer gets to any sort of size, you're starting to move some weight, whether it's the number of oysters or mussels is a volume product often. Finfish is certainly a volume and weight product. So then you start to scale up in terms of the infrastructure. You probably need wharfs that you can back a truck down onto. You probably need wharf with a crane that is able to lift a certain number of pounds, or in some cases tons. You may need a wharf that's able to handle heavy infrastructure. So it may be the gear that the farm is using and being able to lift that and put that on boats. You certainly, one of the challenges we're seeing now with some of the changes in the regulations for shellfish is there's an increasing need for shoreside refrigeration so that you can chill your product down after it comes off the water very rapidly. And that could be quite challenging. Refrigeration, depending on what kind you're using and how it's powered and how efficient it is. In some cases, it needs 3-phase power. Our 3-phase power distribution along the coast of Maine is pretty spotty. So that can be challenging if it's not 3-phase. It can be quite expensive to run. We do have some really interesting technical innovations going on around the use of solar to power refrigeration, and I think there's a lot of potential there, and I'm really excited about some of the innovation that's happening in that space. And then, simple things like access to good roads and access to freight forwarding companies. One of the crazy things about seafood in Maine is it's sometimes necessary to ship something to Boston to a distribution hub, and then it gets shipped back to Maine through a food service company. So that can be challenging and perhaps a little bit inefficient. So the distribution networks, I think, are another place where we really need to focus on and make some improvements in the state of Maine. The one other thing that when you talk about infrastructure, and this is a challenge not just for us, but also for commercial fishing, is worker housing. It is becoming so difficult for workers and young people to afford housing in coastal communities. Many of our folks have got people commuting from as long as an hour away before they get on the boat or before they work in the processing and packing plant. So affordable housing is an issue, certainly for both us and the commercial fishing community. And then access to clean, efficient, and modern processing and packing houses. It's interesting, the aquaculture sector has, in the last 10 years, by my count, and I probably am not counting them all, I think we have counted 10 brand new processing or packing facilities that have been built along the coast of Maine. If you compare that to the commercial fishing sector, I think they have built maybe 2 or 3 in the last time period. So there's been some pretty significant investment in that processing and packaging infrastructure. And that actually should tell folks about the confidence in the aquaculture sector. If people are investing in processing and packaging infrastructure, that means they're pretty confident they're going to be able to get their hands on product to put through those plants.
Great. All right, we have one more audience question. We're running up against 1 o'clock.
Yep.
You note that diversity in species, production methods, and company size is necessary for industry resilience and for maintaining working waterfronts. What do you envision is necessary and feasible to ensure such diversity is maintained in a time when consolidation is becoming more common in the commercial space?
It's a great question. We have things in place currently in the state of Maine, which I think will inherently inhibit consolidation over a certain size. And just to put things in perspective, in Washington state, you have one shellfish company that either leases or literally outright owns 14,000 acres. In the state of Maine, that could never happen. And in the state of Maine, we have a cap on the size of an individual lease at 100 acres and the cap on how many acres an individual business entity can accumulate, which, depending on what you're growing and how you're growing it, there are different kind of size limits around that. But the bottom line is you can't go over 500 acres in the state of Maine unless you begin to file a site rotation and fallowing plan. So that's a process whereby you as a company would have to, whether you are a family company or whether you're not, you would have to file a plan both with DMR and, in the case of finfish, with DEP, and they would have to review and approve that plan in order for you to go over the 500-acre limit. And then there's an upper limit above that, which is 1,000 acres. So we're never going to see the kinds of industrial, if you will, aquaculture that you hear about in other places in the world. And there's certainly folks who are in the discussion around scale in the state of Maine who love to use examples from other places in the world about industrialization and kind of the evils of consolidation and industrialization. But the reality is it's illegal in Maine. And so the flip side of that is one of the things that we have seen as an association, and Christian Braden, our staff economist, has done some really interesting work around this, is there are economies of scale around aquaculture, and you do need to be above a certain size depending on what species you're growing and depending on what production method you're using and what market you're serving. you need to be above a certain size in order to break even and or to make a profit. And so economies of scales matter unless you are going to be a hobby farmer or a lifestyle choice farmer. And in that case, you clearly are going to have an income coming from another source. And aquaculture will not be your primary source of income. So we have this mix of sizes in Maine. I think it's a very healthy mix. One of the interesting things we're seeing is that a lot of the smaller growers that came into the sector as small growers probably 10, 15 years ago are starting to scale up. They're starting to realize that they need a little bit more space. They need some more equipment in order to be viable from a commercial point of view. And I think that's a healthy thing. That is, you know, the American tradition: start small and work your way up. And providing people with opportunities to do that, I don't think we should feel guilty about that. I think that's part of what has made this country what it is, and it's certainly part of what has made Maine what it is as a state.
Great. Chris, do you want to ask your question? We have one last.
One quick question, Sebastian. We've used working waterfront access funds to purchase working waterfront. Have there been any efforts to have, say, tax reductions, tax incentives to protect working waterfront?
Yeah, so we, in cooperation with the Maine Lobstermen's Association, and Sea Grant and a whole bunch of other folks, we co-founded something called the Working Waterfront Coalition many years ago. And the first two things that coalition worked on were the Working Waterfront Preservation Program, which was the program that would pay somebody if they put a working waterfront easement on their property. And that program has kind of, you know, it's gone along. We've never had enough money. We're going through a recent round of applications right now. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I'm sure there are people on this call who probably are better positioned than I am to remember how many properties we've put these working waterfront easements on and how many boats are linked to those properties. I think the Island Institute is probably the group that has tracked that the best. But the second program is this, what's called the current use taxation program, where you can put a working waterfront easement on your property. It's a codicil on your deed, and theoretically that would then reduce the assessment of the value of that property compared to a residential property, and your town should tax you at a lower rate. There have been some challenges with that because some towns have reacted to that by reassessing the property and upping the value, just based on how real estate values are increasing around the property. But there are some folks who have used that program. I think that property needs to be re-examined and tweaked. I think there are some improvements to that program that would make it more effective and more attractive to people. And so that's one of the areas that we're going to try and work with our colleagues in the commercial fishing sector to improve. There were some changes made to the Working Waterfront Preservation Program in the last legislative session, and those certainly have helped that program have more properties that would qualify and also make it more attractive to people to put a working waterfront easement on their property.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sebastian. This was great. Just a plug for next month's webinar. We have Amani Black and colleagues from Minorities in Aquaculture, and they'll be talking about their experiences as minorities in aquaculture interns. So tune in next month, September 20th, same time.
Great. Thanks, everybody.